Right. Well, let's make a start. So I've got the pleasure of introducing our special guest for our special seminar, Nikki, today. Sam sends his apologies, and he's tied up, as we probably all know. So Nikki's a behavioural ecologist. She's a postdoctoral fellow from Monash, originally from the Netherlands, but since 2014 they've been working on purple-crowned fairy-wrens in the Kimberley, and she's going to be talking to us today about that. Why is Nikki here? Nikki is exploring the possibility of having a DECRA fellowship with us here in Real, and just sent off the notification just now, didn't you, that you'll be applying. So we need to do everything we can to make Nikki feel welcome, show her what a wonderful place Real is, and it is, as I've been telling Nikki while she's here. Nikki's going to be here till tomorrow, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so there are opportunities to have one-on-one chats. Is that you've still got time in your calendar before leaving? But I'll hand it over to you, Nikki. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for coming. So in this talk, I'd like to run you through some of the research I've been doing on purple-crowned fairy-wrens. So as Alan said, it broadly covers their behavioural ecology and also some of the key conservation threats to the species. So I've been studying these birds for 9 years already, and I'm currently a postdoc at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and also affiliated with Monash University and based in Canada, just to make it all more confusing. And this work is all part of a larger long-term project that's led by Anne Peters at Monash University. One sec. There we go. All right, so let me first introduce you to these birds. So here we have a male and female purple-crowned fairy-wren in their breeding plumage. These birds are really small. They only weigh about 10 grams or so. And you can see on the map here that there's two different subspecies. So there's a western and an eastern subspecies that are completely separate. And the western one is listed as endangered. And these birds are riparian habitat specialists, which means that they only live along waterways. So this is kind of what their typical habitat looks like, especially in the western part of their range. They very much rely on this pandanus. So this is the vegetation that they use to find food and for nesting and to find, shelter from the heat, protection from predators.
Sorry
so
to
Professor Anne, go on.
Just to let you know, for us online, your slides have just dropped off.
All right, let me try to fix that.
Apologies.
Yeah, as in it's not screen sharing.
Yeah.
That's so weird, isn't it?
That's back now. That looks good.
Yeah, I haven't started the presentation yet, so let's see if it stays like that. Can you see the slide itself now?
Yes, looks great. Thank you.
All right, perfect. All right, so Anne Peters from Monash University set up a research project to study these birds back in 2005. And our field site is at Australian Wildlife Conservancy's Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary, which is in the central Kimberley. And we monitor this population along two waterways, Annie Creek over here and the Adcock River. So this adds up to about 15 kilometers. And these birds are really territorial. So all of those tiny little polygons you can see on the map there are individual fairy-wren territories. So we can very reliably find our birds along the creek. And this is an individual-based study, meaning that we follow individuals throughout their entire life. And we can do this because all the birds in the population are banded. So each bird has a unique combination of these colored leg bands so that we can individually recognize each bird in the field just by looking at them with our binoculars. So this project has now been running for 18 years, and we've banded and followed 2,225 birds over this period. So how do we follow our birds? Well, firstly, we conducted a really detailed population census at least 2 or 3 times a year. So basically, we observe our birds, we keep track of where they are, who they're with, and what they got up to. So we end up with really detailed maps like this, where each of these little polygons is a social group, and the text box tells us which birds are part of that social group. So we keep track of our birds really well. Another thing that makes a study really special is that because these birds are riparian specialists and because they're so territorial and therefore also really responsive to playback, we can use a really efficient search technique to find birds that leave our core study area. So in this map, you can see our core study area and creeping out for here in orange. And once per year, we survey all of those surrounding sites that we know have suitable habitat for these fairy-wrens as well. And as you can see, it involves some pretty amazing fieldwork as well, which is always a plus. So by doing these surveys, we are able to find birds that move really far. So we've actually had one bird which hatched right here on Henny Creek, and it then traveled all the way up all of these waterways to the northern section of the Han River. And that's a journey of 68 kilometers, which is a lot for a teeny tiny bird. And doing these surveys also means that we can distinguish death from dispersal for the birds in our core area. So it means that we have really good estimates for their survival. We also monitor the breeding activity by the wrens. So we follow females and we look for any signs of breeding and find a nest, because the females are the ones that build the nest, as you can see here. So most wet seasons, which is their main breeding season, we're at the field site day in, day out, following all of the breeding activity by the wrens. So to do this, we look for nests. Once we found one being built, we regularly check it until eggs are laid and then hatch. And you can see from these photos, we've been doing this under any conditions. So even during a flood, I'll swim out to the nest to check it, or we'll use ladders to get up to those really high and hard to reach nests. And then when the chicks are old enough, when they're about 7 days old, which is only a week before they fledge, we take them out of the nest to ban them. We then return them to the nest and we keep checking on it, waiting for the chicks to fledge. So this process allows us to monitor what makes the nest succeed or fail. So with these different field methods, we've been able to follow birds throughout their life. So we have really good information on these birds and their behavior. So to show an example of this female here, her band combination is Azure and Lime, so her name is ABL. And she was born in December 2015 in territory 121B. And then in November 2016, she was briefly seen visiting a territory further up north along the creek, but she returned home immediately after. But a month later, she made the move down south and she joined territory 117 as a non-breeding subordinate. Although she was briefly seen visiting her old home again just for a couple of hours in January. In May 2017, at 1.5 years of age, she moved to a new territory and she found herself a mate there, whose name is ANR. So she joined him there as a dominant breeder. But unfortunately, her partner didn't last long and he died shortly after. So 1 month later, she moved again and she joined male ASMC after his partner had died as well. So in January of 2018, she tried to breed for the first time, but her nest got washed away in a flood before she even laid eggs. So in February, she tried again. She laid eggs this time, but they got eaten by a predator. So in March, she gave it another go. She laid 3 eggs and they all hatched and we actually banned the 2 chicks, but then not long after that, they got eaten by a kookaburra. But it's not all bad news for this little bird. Later that year, she was one of the few birds to successfully breed during the dry season. So a few months later, we caught and we banded her fledgling here, who we called EON. But after 1.5 years of being with her mate, he passed away too. And so she ended up moving again to join another male in his territory. But a few months after that, at 3.5 years of age, she died herself. So this is the type of information we have for all of our birds. Not all of their life stories are as dramatic and sad, but this is the kind of info we've got. So how did I get involved in all this? Well, in 2014, I was, a bright-eyed, enthusiastic master's student at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And I was very much developing myself as a field researcher and a behavioral ecologist. So I was really keen to do more adventurous fieldwork in an interesting study system. So I reached out and I joined the Purple Crowned Fairy-wren project for a 6-month research project for my master's initially. And well, long story short, I never really left. So I got to do lots of amazing fieldwork over the years, and I ended up doing my PhD on this study system and postdoc work after that as well. So the first half or so of my research on these birds has been in behavioral ecology, specifically looking at their social behavior, things like cooperative breeding and how it links to predation. And after that, my research has taken on more of a conservation focus, looking at how these fairy-wrens are affected by invasive cane toads, but for example, by fire and climate change as well. My current postdoc is looking at dispersal behavior for the birds. So it combines those aspects of behavioral ecology and conservation quite nicely. So I'll just run you through some of the behavioral ecology work I've done first. So what initially really drew me to these fairy-wrens is the fact that they're cooperative breeders. So what this means is that cooperative breeders, they live in social groups, and subordinate group members or helpers, I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably, subordinates and helpers, they don't breed for themselves, but instead they help the breeding pair in the group to raise their young. Now, individuals should always be selfish, right? And they should only really invest in their own reproduction. So it doesn't make sense to help raise offspring that is not your own from an evolutionary perspective. But nonetheless, we see this behavior in a range of animals. For example, in mammals, like those meerkats at the top left. We see it in fish, like cichlids, but it's particularly well studied in birds, such as those communally nesting weavers at the bottom left, and of course in Australian fairy-wrens. And since helping is costly, cooperative breeding really has become a model system to study the evolution of group living and cooperation in general. So to understand why animals might stay in a group and help to raise the young of others, we need to understand the benefits that might be driving this behavior. So let me just run you through these. So firstly, there's benefits from group living itself. For example, if you're living in a larger group, you might have a lower chance of getting taken by a predator. Or by staying in a group, you might increase your chances of reproducing in the future. For example, because you might eventually inherit a breeding spot in the group, or because you might be able to pair up with another subordinate and form your own breeding group. And lastly, birds that stay at home with their parents might benefit from the parents giving them better access to food or better protection from predators. So one thing that becomes clear from that is that the social environment can play a really important role here and affect those benefits of staying in a group. And in the purple-crowned fairy-wren, we know that groups consist of a dominant breeding pair and often a mix of male and female related and unrelated subordinates. And we know all of those social and genetic relationships for our birds. So we know that birds often share a group with a mix of relatives and potential mates and competitors. So when I say potential mates here, I mean group members of the opposite sex that are unrelated to you, whereas reproductive competitors are unrelated group members of the same sex. And so these different types of group members can offer different benefits of living in a group with them. So firstly, like I kind of said before, birds that stay at home with their parents, they might benefit from parents giving them better access to resources such as food. Having potential mates in the group is also really beneficial because the population is pretty much saturated. You may have noticed in those maps earlier, there's one territory after the other. So it's really hard for birds to find a breeding spot somewhere. So if a bird in the group is unrelated to the opposite sex dominant, then it has a better chance of inheriting the breeding position in the group when the same sex dominant dies. Or if you have a subordinate potential mate in a group, you might be able to pair up with them and split off from the territory to form your own. So it's clear from this that having relatives and potential mates in a group can be really beneficial, whereas those competitors aren't beneficial at all. And I kind of confirmed the importance of these group members in my research as well by measuring the strength of social bonds between birds and groups. So to do this, I basically spent many, many hours just watching groups and recording how often they engage in affiliation with each other, which strengthens social bonds, and how often there's aggressive interactions, which obviously have a negative impact on social bonds. And I found that birds form strong social bonds, which are beneficial of themselves, specifically with relatives and with potential mates, whereas they form antagonistic relationships with reproductive competitors. So this kind of shows that who birds share a social group with very much influences how beneficial it is for them to be in that group. And so I thought that that might also affect their choices when it comes to having behavior at the nest. So besides these benefits of group living, birds might also stay and help to raise young because of benefits associated simply with helping raise offspring itself. For example, subordinates might be receiving indirect kin-selected benefits if they're helping to raise young that are related to them. And so by raising those young, they're indirectly passing on their own genes as well. Or helping might actually signal quality to potential mates in a group, and so increase their chances of maybe getting a mate themselves. And lastly, if helpers have a chance of becoming a breeder in the group in the future, then they might actually be helping to raise young because they will provide help to them in the future when they're a breeder. So I tested which of all of these benefits might drive cooperative breeding in purple crowned fairy-wrens. So for this, I first looked at help with offspring provisioning. So I looked at nests and I would record how often each bird comes to feed the chicks in the nest. And interestingly, none of those benefits that I just explained that are associated with helping raise offspring in the group explain this behavior. So helpers didn't feed any chicks in the nest to impress potential mates in the group. How related helpers were to the young in the nest also didn't affect how much they fed them. So it's not explained by kin selection either. And helpers also didn't feed young to receive more help in the future when they become a breeder themselves. Instead, what I found that how much helpers feed chicks depends on who they share a group with. So specifically, it depends on the type of breeders that they're helping by doing so. So I'll run through this step by step. So if helpers are unrelated to both of the breeders, so if they will be helping a potential mate and a competitor, they don't do anything at all. Whereas if they're helping a potential mate and a relative, they do quite a lot. They do slightly less if they're helping a relative and a competitor. And similarly, if they're helping two relatives. So this means that helpers will only feed chicks if they're related to at least one breeder. And they do the most when they're not just helping relatives, but also a potential mate. So essentially when they get the most benefits out of it. Because these potential mates and relatives, they're associated with those social bonds which are beneficial. They can provide kin-selected benefits, potential for nepotism, as well as potential for future mating. So what this means is that these birds are feeding chicks to support breeders that in turn might offer benefits to them. So really they're looking out for their own interest rather than just acting altruistically by feeding these young. But in many species, helpers don't just help by feeding young, which is, you know, oh, hello. Good, how are you? I'm about halfway through, sorry. So just explain those. Okay. That's fine. I've just gone through like the social background of the wrens. Main take home so far is that they like having potential mates and relatives in the group. They're really beneficial. And you'll hear the rest. All right. Nice. Oh yeah, you'll know it all. Yeah. So I've just gone through why helpers help to feed chicks in the nest, but in a lot of species, helpers will also join in defense against predators or brood parasites. And this is where they can make a really big difference because a single act can really make the difference between life and death for the chicks in the nest or for group members. And it's becoming more clear that defending the nest against these predators and brood parasites might actually play a really important role in the evolution of cooperative breeding. So, for example, there's clear overlap between the prevalence of cooperative breeding and brood parasites, as well as between cooperative breeding and the density of predators. And so this is suggesting that maybe cooperative breeding evolved because larger groups are better able to protect the nest from these brood parasites and these predators. And in purple crowned fairy-wrens, nest predation is also the biggest source of nest failure. So about 60% of our nests get depredated every year. And this is by a whole variety of predators. So we see predation by pheasant cuckoos, by goshawks, various species of goanna, and various species of snake as well. And on top of that, purple-crowned fairy-wren nests occasionally get parasitized by cuckoos as well. So helpers can potentially play a really important role in increasing nest success by helping to defend the nest from these threats. And we know that helper fairy-wrens do this as well. So I'm about to show you a video as a good example of this. But before I play, just a heads up, everything will happen really fast. So keep an eye on this small goanna that's approaching the nest from the right here, because they'll just come storming in. So that was really quick, but that was the breeding pair and the helper working together to fight off the goanna. Keep an eye on the nest still, because it's going to come back again. And again, it was really quick, but by working together, they were successful at fighting off the goanna, and a week later, this nest had actually fledged. So that's a really clear advantage to breeders to receive help with raising and defending young. But it begs the question, why would helpers defend against these threats? So to find out why they might do this, I measured nest defense behavior in response to 4 different models that I placed near the nest. So I used a goanna, which is a predator of nests, a goshawk, which is a predator of nests, but also adults. And then I had a cuckoo, which can obviously lay eggs in a fairy nest, but they can also depredate nests. And I used the control model, which birds never responded to, which is great. So I would then sit in a hide and I would watch the birds and record how much each of the birds helps with defending the nest. So I caught myself in a camera trap image here. So that's me in a hide. There's the little nest entrance, and then that's my cuckoo model in front of it there. And these trials worked really well. So I'll just show a quick video of a female responding to a goanna model. She's clearly very upset, which is exactly what I wanted. So the trials worked really well. So I wanted to find out why fairy-wrens help to defend young in the nest. So to do this, I tested those same hypotheses as I did previously for help with offspring feeding. So firstly, helpers might defend the nest of perhaps breeding themselves. So if that's the case, then they should work harder if there's a potential mate nearby to show off to, but that wasn't the case. Another option is that they're protecting young in the nest because they're related to them. And so if they survive, they're indirectly passing on their own genes as well. But I found that how related helpers were to the young in the nest didn't affect their decision to help defend at all. And they'd often help to defend young that were unrelated even. So it's not keen selection either. So another reason helpers might defend is if they have a chance of becoming a breeder in the group themselves. And so the more young they help them to raise now, the more help they will get in the future when they are a breeder themselves. So to test whether this might be the case, I looked at how likely helpers are to become a breeder in the group. And we can calculate this exactly because we know from our previous research what this depends on. And we can use the long-term data set to calculate how often subordinates inherit a breeding position when the same-sex breeder dies. So this plot here shows helpers' likelihood to defend against nest predators according to this probability to inherit a breeding position. And so it shows that helpers are more likely to defend the nest if they have a higher chance of becoming a breeder. So what this means is that helpers are more willing to defend young that might be their future helpers so that they receive more help when they become a breeder themselves down the line. So they're really looking at those future benefits. But if we look at how subordinates responded to those 3 different predator models, we see that they're much more willing to defend against a goshawk, which is a predator of nests and adults, whereas cuckoos and goannas are only a threat to the nest. So this suggests that helpers care much more about group members than about young in the nest. So why would they care so much about saving their group members? Well, like I explained before, not all group members are the same, and helpers especially value group members that are relatives or that are potential mates. So I tested which group members birds are most willing to defend from a dangerous predator that could do harm to them by looking at who is under direct threat of being hurt. And this is where it gets quite interesting. So cuckoos and goannas don't pose a threat to adults. And when those were present, helpers responded the same regardless of who was around. So it doesn't make a difference whether there's any potential mates or any relatives around. But when a goshawk is present, they do care who is under threat. So if a potential mate or if a relative could get taken by the goshawk, then helpers suddenly double their defense effort. So that means that these birds know exactly who they're willing to take risks for, and they're really choosing to protect group members that are beneficial to them from a dangerous predator. Okay, so to recap what we know about group living and helping in purple-crowned fairy-wrens, I showed that the type of group members birds share a group with very much determines how they might benefit from being part of that group. And these group members are so important to them that they are more willing to defend them from predators than young in the nest. And these birds are really calculated in who they want to help, mainly protecting potential mates and relatives from a dangerous predator. Even helping at the nest reflects similar motivations, with helpers feeding chicks to support those same group members. The only exception is nest defense, which they invest in to increase the amount of help they will receive as a breeder in the future. So they're really playing the long game here, thinking about those long-term benefits and what they might get out of it. So all in all, this really shows that the social environment can really affect the benefits of group living, and in turn that social context can drive cooperative behavior in many cases. All right, so in this next part, I'd like to go through some of the conservation-focused research I've done. And this has been looking at the impacts of key threats on these purple-crowned fairy-wrens and on riparian habitat in a tropical savanna more generally. So coming back to the slide from the start, this is what the typical habitat of these wrens looks like. They very much depend on high-quality riparian vegetation, and this makes them a biological indicator for riparian habitat health. And these riparian zones are really important for a range of species. They're really high in biodiversity. They provide cool microclimates and also corridors for animals to move through landscapes. So they're really important. But the main threats to these birds and to this habitat is habitat loss and degradation, and that's mostly because of cattle and fire. So by studying these wrens, we can get a better understanding of how we can best manage and protect these riparian zones in the tropical savanna. So one novel threat in this area is the invasion of cane toads. I'm sure you're all aware, cane toads have been moving further and further west across northern Australia. So their anticipated distribution is highlighted in green on this map. And I believe that current distribution is now up to where the red line is. They've definitely passed Derby already and are on their way to Broome. So we knew they were coming to our field site, and they arrived at Mornington in 2017. So I kind of took the opportunity to look at what impact the arrival of toads has had at our field site and whether they've affected the fairy-wrens in any way. So the link between cane toads and fairy-wrens might not seem that obvious, but invasive species like the cane toad can really alter ecosystems in different ways. So we know that when toads arrive in a new area, they cause a population decline of predator species that eat them because they're toxic. So especially animals like goannas, snakes, and freshwater crocodiles are really vulnerable. But these all predate on other animals too, such as freshwater turtles, small dragons, tree snakes, but also the nests of birds such as finches and fairy-wrens. So the arrival of toads in a new area might not just negatively affect the predator species that predate on them, but indirectly might also have positive effects on species such as the purple-crowned fairy-wren if their nest predators are suddenly not as abundant anymore as they used to be. So I wanted to investigate the direct and indirect impacts of toads at our field site on the predators and prey there. So to do this for 2 years before and for 3 years after toads arrived, I did surveys to measure the abundance of predators and prey. So this includes reptiles such as goannas, dragons, and also snakes like tree snakes, but also king browns, for example. And I also measured the abundance of avian nest predators, so birds like pheasant cuckoos and goshawks. I also placed camera traps at purple-crowned fairy-wren nest to video record any nest predation attempts so we could see what predators were actually causing nest failure. So you can see from these photos it often involves climbing trees or getting really wet, which is always fun. But the footage is well worth it. So here an example of a goshawk depredating a nest. So pretty cool footage. Got lots of examples like that. So what do we find? So as expected, goanna abundance declined dramatically with the arrival of toads. So we saw a decline of over 70%. But we didn't see a clear change in abundance for any other predators or prey. So what does that mean for fairy-wren nest success then? So I found that before toads arrived, goannas were responsible for 64% of nest predation events. So if they declined in abundance, then surely that should have a positive effect on fairy-wren nest success. But surprisingly, that wasn't the case. And the predation risk was still just as high after toads arrived as it was before. And it seems to me that this is because there's been a change in the type of predators that are depredating fairy-wren nests. So you can see in this graph that after toads arrived, only 27% of nest predation was by goannas compared to those 64% before. So they're definitely depredating nests less often now that they're less common. But what seems to have happened is that instead of fairy-wrens being released from their predators, other predators have taken over instead. So we now see a lot more predation by giant centipedes, which might be unexpected, but also by avian predators such as goshawks and cuckoos and kookaburras, for example. So this shows that invasive species like cane toads can disturb trophic cascades by altering predator-prey dynamics across trophic levels. And this results in altered food webs as is shown here. So it kind of highlights that the effects of invasive species can often be indirect and not immediately obvious. All right, so I'd just like to finish off by highlighting our latest research, which was published very recently. We also wrote an article for the conversation about it if you're interested in reading more. So this research looked at the impact of fire on riparian zones. And it very much is a collaboration between conservation scientists and lab managers. And you might recognize one of the names in the paper as well. So there's a bit of background info, I'm sure you're all aware, but with climate change, wildfires are increasing in frequency and severity. So this is posing a real threat to biodiversity. So of course, prime examples of this are the megafires we've been seeing in recent years, like the Black Summer bushfires in Eastern Australia a couple of years ago. But in the tropical savanna, like up here in the NT, fire is really common, and fire management is often used to reduce the impact of wildfires. So by deliberately introducing fire in the early dry season, when fire generally burns at low intensity, we can help to reduce those large, intense wildfires that are common in the late dry season. But what we don't understand very well is how these fires affect riparian zones, even though the severity of fire is predicted to increase for riparian zones as well. So we really need to better understand how riparian fire affects the species that use this habitat. And purple-crowned fairy-wrens, since they rely on riparian habitat for their entire life, they're a really good species to try to understand these impacts. And throughout the course of our study, we had 2 fires come through the study site. So here you can see the fire scar in black of a low intensity fire that occurred in 2015. So you can see from the scar that the fire was quite small and the burn was nice and patchy, so quite a cool burn. And these polygons show the fairy-wren territories that we study along Annie Creek. So the ones in red are where the fire traveled through. And on the right here, we can see the fire scar for a high intensity fire that occurred a few years later in 2019. Now, although both fires occurred during the late wet season, when fires normally burn at low intensity, 2019 was a really unusual year. It was extremely dry. I think it was the driest year on record at our field site. So this drought, combined with weather conditions at the time, meant that this fire actually burned at a really high intensity. And it acted much more like one of those late dry season wildfires. And teams actually had to go out to try to fight this fire and protect some of the infrastructure. So you can see clearly from this map that this fire burned a really large area and at high intensity. And this fire had a really clear impact on the riparian habitat as well. So these photos were taken at the same spot along the creek. You can see how much damage the fire did to the vegetation. And then throughout the rest of that year, the pandanus died off even further. And even 2 years after the fire, the pandanus hadn't recovered at all. And that section of creek still looks totally different now. So we wanted to know what happened to the birds before, during, and after each fire. And because we follow individual birds throughout their life, we have really good information on their survival, movement, and reproduction before as well as after each of these fires. And as you can see from the map here, we have a really neat control to use as well, because we can compare birds from those burned territories to birds in adjacent territories that didn't get burned. And unfortunately, we found that both fires reduced the number of purple-crowned fairy-wrens for at least 2.5 years. So this graph shows fairy-wren density following a low-intensity fire. So the density of birds in the burned section of creek is indicated by the solid line, and in the unburned section of creek by the dashed line. You can see the timing of fire in the middle of the graph there. And so this low intensity fire reduced fairy-wren density by 20% in the burnt area. Following the high intensity fire, we also saw a really clear reduction in fairy-wren density, and this effect was stronger still. So the number of fairy-wrens in the burnt area was reduced by 50% after the fire. So we wanted to know what caused these declines, and we found that this was different between the two fires. So that low intensity fire caused a decline in wrens because it impacted breeding success. So we made a breeding success by the number of juveniles that groups produce. So that's shown in this graph here. And you can see that their breeding success was reduced by 80% in the burned compared to the unburned area. And that was for the breeding season during which the fire occurred, and then it was still reduced a year after as well. The high intensity fire, on the other hand, impacted survival of the adult birds. So here you can see the survival trajectories for birds in the unburnt area in blue and in the burnt area in red. So if we look at the period during which the fire occurred, we can see that survival is actually unaffected at the time of the fire itself. So birds in the burnt area were no more likely to die during the fire than birds in adjacent unburnt areas. But if we look at the 2 to 8 months after the fire, that's where we really see those survival trajectories diverge. And during this period, birds in the burnt area were 30% more likely to die. So we think this is probably because the habitat was so impacted by that fire. That made it hard for the birds to, find enough food or to find cover from predators or shelter from the heat in those months after the fire. So this really highlights the sensitivity of riparian zones to fire, because even a low intensity burn impacts population numbers. So given the increasing threat of fire, especially to riparian zones, it seems really important to try to minimize the extent and intensity of riparian fire. But we also have to keep in mind that keeping fire out of riparian zones altogether probably isn't feasible either. So the challenge really is to try to minimize fire when it does come into the riparian zone. So based on our findings, we suggest that fire managers can try to create breaks across riparian zones and also try to create protective buffers around it when conditions to do so are right, to try to prevent large sections from burning at once. So I'd just like to finish off by very briefly highlighting what I'm working on at the moment. So my current research is on dispersal, and this combines the fields of behavioral ecology and conservation quite nicely. Because firstly, by studying dispersal, we can better understand the evolution of group living and sociality. Because to understand this, we need to understand why animals stay home instead of leave to breed independently somewhere else. And secondly, knowing where animals go is really important for conservation, because dispersal is really important for populations to stay connected and to persist. But of course, it's threatened by habitat fragmentation. So determining when animals move and when they're successful can help guide conservation. So one of the things I'm doing at the moment is trialing an automated tracking system. So I've got these teeny tiny transmitters, as you can see here. They weigh less than half a gram. So I've been putting those on wrens to trial them, and then I've got automatic receivers that I want to set up along the creek line as well, both in the detailed study area that we monitor throughout most of the year, and also in that larger landscape study area that we survey once per year, where we know that some of those dispersers end up. So this way, we can automatically then detect where birds are and when and where they move. And these fairy-wrens are a really good system to do something like this because they only live and move along those waterways. So it's much simpler to track them because of that. And we've also recently genotyped all the 2,000 and something birds that we've ever banded for 10,000 SNPs. So we've got genomic data that we can link to dispersal as well. So that provides some pretty exciting research opportunities there. All right. So of course, this work would not have been possible without all of these hardworking people. So big thanks to them, and thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, let's see. Maybe we should ask those online first to see if you have any
where
questions.
with them?
They can you still hear us? You're still with us online?
Yes, still here. That was great, Nikki. Thank you.
I'll stop sharing them and make it easier to see.
So any questions from online? If not.
Hi, Nikki. It's Tegan here. How you going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. I vaguely remember I was in Mornington around November, December of 2014.
Yeah.
Doing some glider and quoll stuff. And I do vaguely remember a couple of the sites where the purple crown fairy-wren had been seen, and because I remember people telling us to go down and have a look. I was just wondering that maybe we crossed over there at some point.
We might have. I was there in November 2014.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was too. So, yeah. I just thought that was interesting. Yeah. Just with your towers, is that sort of happening at the moment?
So I don't have, so far I've mostly had tags on birds to first see that they can handle the tags. Because they're an endangered species as well. Of course, the ethics committee wanted us to test that the birds can handle it first, which they can. We've actually had one bird which we found 16 kilometers away still with its tags, so they can even disperse long distances still while carrying the extra load, which is really good. And I've got, I think at the moment at the post office in Connemara, I've got 20 receivers waiting for me, so I can start trialing those out as well and placing them. But the nice thing with the technology that I'm using is we don't actually have to build towers.
Okay.
So there's these really small receivers that I can just put up in a tree or something along the creek line, which makes it much simpler.
Yeah, that sounds great and really interesting. Be interesting. I don't know if you'd have thought about also like tagging like some of the predators.
That would be really interesting. They might not be so easy to catch though.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
That's a whole different ball game.
And you didn't have any predation from gliders?
No, I've never recorded any on camera.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was fantastic. Really enjoyed it, Nikki. And hopefully I'll be in tomorrow and we can catch up.
Yeah, sounds great. I should be around tomorrow.
Thanks, Tegan. Anyone else online? And I've got a question before. So the study area has got a long history of frequent fire, including presumably late season fires. Yet it's saturated by the birds. So I wonder, what does that matter? So look, because when you first said that, I thought, well, why are they endangered then if they're saturating every available habitat? Why are they endangered?
At our study site, it's saturated, which is also why that's where we do the study, because that's so someone back in around 2012 did a PhD where they mapped like the fairy-wrens across the Kimberley. I think I told you about it the other day. And she found that at Mornington, at our specific field site, that's where there is the highest densities of purple-crowned fairy-wrens anywhere. So they're probably they don't seem to be saturated like that in other places. That's pretty unique to our field site.
What are your thoughts on why? Is it because Mornington's just got better habitat, or they mainly
I think so.
fire better, or what's?
Yeah, so a big thing that they did, AWC started managing the property in 2004, I think. And the first thing that they did was fence it off and exclude cattle from it. And that's made a huge difference. So when the project first started, there was something like 100 birds in that area, and now it's up to almost 300. So we've seen a really clear increase in population numbers with the increase in quality of the riparian habitat as well. And that mostly seems to be because cattle has been moved out. And they've also at the same time applied proper fire management. So throughout that whole time that we've been studying the population, or that Anne's been studying the population since 2005, those two fires are the only ones that have actually come close to the creek. Yeah.
But that's around Anne Creek, which is also where. Yeah.
Yeah, there's infrastructure to protect as well. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a bit extra special treatment.
Yeah.
And did the flood influence them? About the flood?
Like did it influence the wrens, you mean? Or so we want to look at that in detail at some point, and because we've had various floods come through over the years, none of them as extreme as the one that started this year. We'd like to look at what exactly it does to the birds, but we haven't properly analyzed it yet. We have kind of looked at survival numbers after this most recent flood, because people were worried that the water reached record levels. We were worried that maybe the birds would have struggled to find a place high enough to avoid the floodwaters, especially because it seems like it peaked during the night, and the birds don't have very good night vision. And we saw that adult survival was about, I think it was 74% over the last wet season, whereas normally it will be 86% or higher. So there's been a slight reduction in their survival, but not too dramatically. They've definitely had their breeding season has been pushed way back as a result of the flood. So in May, when we first came back there, they hadn't bred all that much, when normally they would have bred a lot during that period. But instead, they seem to have just kept going during the dry season. They're resilient little birds.
I was curious about how you score the social bond stuff, like the aggressive behavior. Isn't that obvious stuff, or is that fine?
Well, after a bit of watching the birds, it becomes pretty easy to recognize. So usually, like, their affiliative behavior is they'll be preening each other, for example, which is like clearly a really like bonding, a social interaction. What they do a lot as well is something that we call contact sit, where they just sit next to each other, like literally touching, and they're just resting together on a pandanus frond or something. And then something like aggression is of course more obvious. It's like actually attacking or chasing off or something like that. And then from that quantify the strength of a social bond, it's pretty simple. You just essentially add up the number of positive interactions and deduct the number of negative ones, and then a really clear pattern came out of that. So it's very similar to how a lot of studies have been done on primates. Yeah.
Might have been possibly done since she was had this idea that it was almost an alternative states kind of scenario for the pandanus lined waterways, but when they got absolutely hammered by cattle and fire, they just sort of stay in that open, you know, sort of seasonal waterways type scenario. It was very hard to get back to the sort of green, lush, perennial, you know, pandanus line sort of one, whereas they were kind of in that state and maintained high moisture, high shade sort of thing that they were, you know, well, quite nice habitats for this sort of thing. But if you push them over that threshold of too much cattle disturbance and too many other things, then
because one of the
evaporation rates and everything sort of stopped it from getting back to that.
and one of the big issues that you get then as well, which we've definitely seen in recent years with those bigger floods, is you get a lot of erosion in those cattle flogged areas, and sometimes you, like we've seen, like whole big chunks of bank being dragged downstream, and then that's literally a whole pandanus patch that's suddenly just gone that would have taken decades to get to where it was. Yeah.
But another question.
Yep.
By geographic one. So can the map of the two subspecies, where we just jumped, and in between them was the top end, which is just full of suitable habitat. What's happening there, do you think?
I don't know. Is the short answer. I don't know too much about the habitat that's in between the two. I'd have to look at a map with all the waterways.
Amounts of that sort of pandanus. Huge amounts.
In that strip in the middle there as well. That's the break. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is. Well, they would have been there historically at one point, but yeah, I'm not sure. Well, presumably they were like much more common all across northern Australia once upon a time. Like once upon a time, those two subspecies probably would have been connected. But yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry. There's a lot about that. Yeah, habitat usage that we don't actually really understand or know. Yeah. Like it's strange as well that in the western part of the range, they need pandanus, and then the eastern part, they don't need it at all, and they use rivergrass instead.
We have a range of other things like finches taking up that pandanus sort of habitat.
Yeah. What about buff-sided robins? Are they there? Buff-sided robins are another like riparian indicator species. Yeah.
A lot of other crimson finches.
Yeah. Yeah.
Switching from ants.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
I just seems strange because the top end would be their prime habitat.
Yeah. Yeah, it is strange. Yeah. 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 But it does look like, because they are so dependent on waterways, like they'll never even cross a kilometre of land to go from one waterway to another, as far as we know. So presumably if they were there once upon a time, when they disappear from one catchment, they're never going to come back there anymore without help. So that's what happened with the Ord River as well. When they put Lake Argyle in, when they put in the dam, they disappeared from that whole river system.
Oh, thanks, Nikki.
Thank you. All right. I'll log off of Teams. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nikki. See you later.